Welcome to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to our viewers. This is a special edition of the program since it is also being run as a United Nations Food Systems Summit independent dialogue by the WTO Secretariat. In this webinar, I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I will be opening the floor to questions from you, the viewers. Please send your questions to dialogues@wto.org. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I'll be moderating this debate. I'd like to begin by providing some context for today's webinar entitled Enabling Agricultural Trade. As many of you who are following the preparatory work for the United Nations Food Systems Summit may know, much discussion is currently underway on how food systems can be transformed, modernized, and made more fit for purpose. We need food systems that can feed a growing planet in terms of population, but we also need food systems that respect that planet and its environment. Food systems need to be safe and need to provide us with healthy and nutritious food. We also need to be looking after our farmers. Trade has been raised by multiple stakeholders in the preparatory process for the summit, and to my surprise, mostly in the form of people asking, how can we trade more? And how can we be part of the international agricultural trading system? This episode is therefore designed to explore how agricultural trade can be enabled. We have representatives from various international organizations with us today, the FAO, the World Bank, the OECD, and we also have farmers, the agro-food industry, and banking. This, in addition to a number of WTO colleagues specialized in initiatives and programs designed to help developing and least developed countries build their trade capacity and infrastructure. Before I turn to the panel, let me set out for viewers what is often considered the hierarchy of enabling conditions for a competitive agricultural sector. That hierarchy includes land tenure and property rights, infrastructure such as roads, transportation, storage facilities, and the digital infrastructure, trade policy, financial services, standards and regulations, research and development, business development services, and the ease of doing business. Trade policy is fundamental to a competitive agricultural sector. Good trade policy is also key to the entire hierarchy of enabling conditions that I have just set out. For instance, it improves the competitiveness of a country's financial services sector. And we have Rabobank with us today, the ease of doing business through trade facilitation. And it also provides for a more transparent, non-discriminatory, and science-based system of standards and regulations. So let me, without further ado, introduce our very distinguished panel to you. Marian Jansen, Director of the Trade and Agricultural Directorate of the OECD. Geeta Sethi, Advisor and Global Lead for Food Systems at the World Bank. Ariana Giuliodori, Secretary General of the World Farmers Organization. Boubacar bin Belhassan, Director of the Markets and Trade Division of FAO. Robert de Vrede, Executive Vice President of Global Foods at Unilever. Barry Martin, Member of the Managing Board of Rabobank, responsible for international, rural, retail banking, leasing, and sustainability. And from the WTO, we have Melvin Sprey, Head of Standards and Trade, of the Standards and Trade Development Facility of the WTO. And we will be joined by Michael Roberts very soon, who is the head of the Aid for Trade unit of WTO. So let me start with the first round of questions then. I'll be managing time very strictly since we would like to get to our very large audience and allow them to put questions to all of you. Geeta, I will start with you as global lead for food systems at the World Bank and the person following the Food Systems Summit preparations. What can you tell us about the main transformations of food systems that are being explored at the summit?
Well, thank you. It is such an amazing pleasure and honor for me to be here with such an august thought leaders from different parts of the economy and development organizations. Let me start by saying that it's fascinating to see how, and it's really a humbling experience for me to talk about food systems, because the way we are growing food is either creating a bankrupt planet or unhealthy people. 3 billion people, or every second person on this planet, is either going hungry, eating the wrong kinds of calories, or micronutrient deficiencies, or eating too much. Food and agriculture, the way we see it now, the way we know this sector, is contributing 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but is going to be at 70% with business as usual by 2050. Look at the efficiency of this system or lack of. Food loss and waste uses the size of arable land of China, and we are losing 1/3 of production that of produce that uses 25% of fresh water. Already food and agriculture uses 70% of water, of which this is used for food that's either lost or wasted. Have you heard of Nissan, creating 3 cars and dumping 1? But we have this in the food and ag space. It's also the biggest driver of biodiversity losses. So when we think about a food system fit for purpose, clearly it has to be a system that contributes to a healthy people, healthy planet, and healthy economy. In accordance with this vision, and that is exactly, I think, the vision for the Food Summit, and the whole story of the food systems transformation has hit and is important both to global North and global South. And 2020 has really demonstrated how fragile economic development is and how inefficient our supply chains are. And in accordance with this vision of people, planet, economy, healthier than we have now, the food system contributes to a healthy economy by being a driver of inclusive growth. It contributes to healthy people by providing healthy diets, which means that it's affordable and accessible, and it's directly linked to the quality of human capital. It contributes to a healthy planet by nature-based solutions. And there's a big gap between vision and reality. And the last piece of work that Folu did, and that was released in 2019, Growing Back Better, demonstrates that the total market value of food systems is actually subtracting rather than adding. With this, with sort of this vision in the background, I think the important thing to understand is how do we finance this big transformation? And there are three big buckets that I would like to just reference very quickly here. The first is this entire public support to agriculture and food, which is in the realm of about $700 billion a year. What's very clear with evidence and science is this 700 billion that's been defined for right intention is not delivering on what was the objective. So there's a lot of room to repurpose these resources in a way that actually does deliver a transformed food system. The second big catalytic sort of leverage is north of $2 trillion of private finance that is in this space. And how do we create the right incentives, the right de-risking environments that these resources do get used effectively for greening the supply chains and really bringing forth and leapfrogging on the digital, on the transformation, on the technologies in a way that we can think about the carbon sequestration for soil. Can we think about soil as a new asset class? Can we think about eco-payments? Think of farmers of the 21st century. They're no longer just producers of food. They could also be a really big contributor to our entire planetary boundary agenda. And the third big bucket that really needs to be leveraged is consumer financing on food. The world global economy, GDP, is about 87 trillion. 12 to 15% is consumer spending in this space. We are talking about 12 to 15 trillion dollars here. That's a big bucket that can influence on the demand side in terms of what the world should be really consuming in a way that really creates a planet, people, and economy story. Alongside, I think, and very quickly, targeted social protection programs have to really be leveraged to really bring about, to really do a big rethink in terms of losers and winners and the trade-offs. The trade-offs will happen, but they can be compensated. Resources are there, they just need to be repurposed. Debt sustainability, we do know this agenda is on the table. Countries will need to rethink their debt servicing plans. Can we bring food systems to the core of sustainability? My answer is yes, we can, we should. And the entire business opportunity is $4.5 trillion of new business opportunity. We just need to provide the right de-risking environments to shift capital out of old economy into more sustainable food assets. And finally, my last point is, I think the UN Food Systems Summit is a very important call for action. It has really engaged all the countries, relevant stakeholders, and we need to be able to now really demonstrate that the boutiques that we've been working on are scalable, and what's not scalable, let's get rid of it and really move into creating the right environment from the policy side, the public side, and the consumer side for healthy people, planet, economy. Let me stop there and pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Geeta, and I'm glad that your connection held. We know that you're connecting from India and have had some challenges. Geeta, a lot of important messages in what you said. First of all, you know, the idea that there are wrong calories. We have people who are overweight, but we have people who are undernourished. What you said about food loss, you know, I mean, the idea that I think your example of Nissan, the idea that Nissan would throw out one out of every 3 cars is something unimaginable, and yet this is happening every day with our food systems. So thank you for that excellent introduction. Boubacar, let me move over to you. From an FAO perspective, what is the role of trade and trade policy in promoting a competitive agricultural sector?
Thank you, Dua. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to join this very important event. And I would start by saying that in FAO, as an organization dealing with food security, that trade affects the 4 dimensions of food security, which are food availability, access, stability, and utilization. And in FAO also, we recognize the important role that international markets and trade can play in contributing to global food security, to better nutrition, and of course also to achieving SDG 2 on zero hunger. Now on your question, one of the key findings of our latest edition of our flagship report, the State of Agricultural Commodity Markets, was that 1/3 of all agri-food exports are traded within global value chains, GVCs, that involve at least 3 countries. So primary agricultural commodities are produced, they get exported, they go to another country, process it into different products, final probably food products, which in turn are exported to third country. This way, global value chains, I would say, create closer links between various countries and actors compared to other forms of trade. What I want to say is that this changing structure of global trade in food and agriculture is important to acknowledge because it sets the framework within which we can assess the role of trade in promoting a more competitive agricultural sector and identify also the trade and related policies that are needed to make this happen. The rapid development of global value chains, or GVCs, has meant that developing countries have wider opportunities to participate in international markets and trade, which can provide a powerful mechanism for diffusing technology and also knowledge and best practices. And this helps to promote a competitive agricultural sector by boosting productivity and raising the incomes, of course, of farmers. And we have shown, in fact, in our report, SOCO, that a 10% increase in GVC participation can result in an increase in agricultural labor productivity by over 1%, and this is in the short run, and the gains can be larger in the medium to the long run. Also, given that the production cycle is divided into stages when we talk about GVC, developing country can participate in those stages in which they have a comparative advantage. And this is also another important aspect of GVCs. However, at the same time, we should also recognize that trade and GVCs bring risks for some actors, and this is something we should not forget. In developing countries, for instance, smallholder farmers have low rates of commercialization. We also know that markets for insurance, for services, for credit, either fail to function properly or are entirely missing. So in this context, the emergence of GVCs with their stringent requirement in terms of food quality and safety standard can lead to further marginalization of small-scale actors. So we need to be also mindful of this. And this is why we need to promote an inclusive business models in order to address some of these issues and hopefully leave no one behind, which is the motto of the 2030 agenda. I would say that to mitigate these risks and harness the full benefits of trade for improving agricultural competitiveness, which was around the question you asked, Dua, it is crucial to ensure coherence and alignment of policies across a host of areas. And this is key, and it's very, very important, which is including trade, agriculture, the environment, health, technology, and education. So we know we can no longer afford to approach policy in a silo approach. And to achieve this, we need to act on different fronts, and I will mention very few examples just to provide an illustration of what I'm saying. For instance, we need to improve rural infrastructure and access to services, education and training, and production technology, which is we want it to be also tailored and accessible to smallholders, small fishers, and small producers. We need also to ensure adequate provision of social safety nets. It's also important because we have to protect those that are adversely affected by trade competition. We need to make sure that they are not excluded from or not being protected. We need also to promote measures to support upgrading and upskilling and to strengthen the capacities to meet market requirements. So these are small examples, but finally, let me try to conclude on the question. I would like to also highlight that the importance of a fair, transparent, and open global trading system that would promote competitiveness or better competitiveness in the agri-food sector, and also to help developing countries to pursue their development needs. And this regard, I would like to highlight or to emphasize the importance of strengthening capacities in developing countries. This is really key in order to pursue their objective, and also of more developing, more better and more collaborative partnerships. And here I speak about all types: South-South, North-South, and triangular. So these are, I see as important element to promote a better competitiveness in the agriculture sector, and also underlining that it has to be inclusive. Thank you, Dua.
Thank you very much, Boubacar, and thank you for putting the focus on global value chains. Our food today is produced within global value chains, which means that there are many different pieces of the puzzle as different foods move across the globe, and all these different pieces need to connect, and they need to connect properly for supply chains to function. And therefore, your emphasis on not having siloed policies is key to supporting those value chains. Thank you also for speaking about the smallholder farmer and the risk to the smallholder farmer, because in fact, the FAO itself tells us that half of the world's hungry are the smallholder farmers, another terrible contradiction, tragic contradiction in global food systems. Marion, let me now come to you. The purpose of the Food Systems Summit is to discuss food system transformation. And yet, what I'd like to ask you is whether trade policy, agricultural trade policy, is itself in need of transformation. And if so, what are the priorities in your view?
Thank you, Doa, and thank you for inviting the OECD to this meeting. Yes, agricultural trade policy may need to think about transforming itself, also because it's going to be important for the future. What we are observing is that the growth in production of agricultural goods is taking place in different places of the world than the growth in demand. And that's why we have been seeing agricultural trade increasing over time, including in the past COVID-19 year, and we expect this to continue. So agricultural trade will be on the forefront. If we want to make agricultural trade and trade policies work for food systems, and we target the OECD about 3 challenges there, we call them the challenge to meet food security objectives, livelihood objectives, and sustainability objectives. And I think these 3 challenges are very well aligned with Gita's people, planet, and economy. We just use different terms. If we want agricultural trade to contribute to this and policies to be designed accordingly, what do we have to pay attention to? I would like to discuss this matter around 3 items. I think we have to think about trade policies in agriculture as an holistic and coherent, to take Boubacar's words, asset. So coherence is important and being holistic. Second, transparency is important. And last but not least, we have to pay attention to policy processes. And under that item, I will come back to Gita's points. We have to look at things in a holistic way. Trade policy, many people think of tariffs, but in the context of agricultural trade, regulations, food safety standards, but also producer support are key. Or called producer support subsidies. These are key items to look at, and we have to look at them in coherence. For agricultural trade to work, we also need to look at other items of trade, services trade, trade in seeds, or even data. Data flows across the globe. So a holistic view is important. The second point I want to mention is transparency, the importance for transparency around agricultural trade. And there, I would like to emphasize a very feel-good story that we have had, I believe, during the COVID-19 crisis. It's around the agricultural market information system. That's a platform that has been put in place very much under the leadership of FAO with other institutions like the OECD collaborating. It's an information platform providing information on trade policies, but also on trade flows, availability of supplies and prices. And that kind of information has contributed to trust in markets during a crisis situation and has contributed to maintaining markets stable. That system currently covers only a certain number of crops. Maybe we want to think of whether we need that type of transparency that goes beyond the typical policy transparency for more markets. So my first point, holistic approach, second point, transparency, and the third point, very important, policy processes. And there I'm going to be very honest, Doa. The 700 billion number that Gita already mentioned, 700 billion annually of producer support, that's a number that OECD published last year. It's related to numbers we have been publishing for 30 years. We have been publishing for 3 decades information on producer support to the agricultural sector. We have seen changes, we have seen a bit of reduction, we have seen some changes in the way producer support is delivered, but the change has not been rapid enough. So if you have been transparent and have produced numbers for 30 years and we still have a problem, then we have to start to look into why we still have this problem. We think a deep look at policy processes will be important. There, not only the facts will matter, the numbers that I just mentioned, but also understanding the underlying interests of different players and understanding values. What is important to me may not be important to you, Doa, or to Gita when it comes to food. What kind of food should be available? How does the price matter, the quality? And that even bigger differences exist around the globe. It is important in our view to distinguish where are we in conflict of interests and where are we in conflict of values, and to design different and appropriate policy processes to solve this. By taking a holistic approach, being more transparent, and also looking deeply into the policy processes, we hope that agricultural trade and agricultural trade policy can in the future provide a stronger contribution to the food systems of the future.
Marian, thank you so much. A fascinating set of comments there. A holistic approach, transparency and policy processes. In particular, I think what is very striking in your comments is that we need to have a very honest conversation about underlying interests and values, as you say, because indeed the lack of progress is striking. And there's a need to just start doing things differently and to take a deeper look as to why we have the current paralysis. Robert, I would now like to move to you and to come to the private sector. Unilever produces a wide range of foods and drinks across the globe. How has trade policy enabled Unilever to create what it calls global foods? And what does a company like Unilever look for in trade policy to promote its business?
Thanks, Doa, and thanks for having me. Look, our ambition with Unilever is to use our scale, our brands, our talent to feed the planet in a healthier and more sustainable way. Yeah? To do this effectively and efficiently, we advocate for trade policies that allow and help food systems to be resilient, open, and international. Export control leads to stockpiling, food unavailability, again leading then to food price inflation, and actually the biggest negative impact is on poorer countries and poorer consumers. Yeah? We are a global business, but we are built from local presence, and time after time we constantly experience localization does not lead to more resilience or better prices. We need more cross-border resilience, optionally, and robust food systems. And it's important to work together with all parties and partners involved throughout the entire value chain. Yeah? Global supply chains allow companies like ourselves to increase the supply of critical foods, to respond to changing consumer needs, but also to tackle some of these very important interventions that the previous speakers have already talked about. Yeah? We believe that post-COVID, food system resilience is better served with stronger and more globally integrated supply chains. And we need trade policies that enable that. No, actually, that promote to do so. So let me try to make it concrete. What would we want from trade policies? We would want trade policies that allow for that agility. Now, tariffs are one thing, but like Marian said, if we have specific regulations in place that prevent us to ship food products, whether it's agricultural products or finished good, from one place to another, we are not doing ourselves a favor, not in terms of solving pandemic crises, but also not in order to change, let's say, this whole value chain for a more sustainable world. We need trade policies that stimulate investment on the ground to allow, let's say, more local production, not as a local production mindset and necessity, but as means to resilience and affordability and availability. We need to stimulate innovation to make sure that we are practicing our production to the latest standards, to the latest technology insights, helping us to increase our yield whilst we are reducing the inputs that we are using. Yeah. But probably most important of it all, whether we're talking about a global or a local value chain, we need to stimulate more usage of sustainably sourced ingredients, a higher use of regenerative agriculture to really indeed tackle that enormous wave of climate change that is coming our way. Yeah? And we believe we can only do that if indeed we come to a more global, open, transparent food value supply chain. Yeah? So that would be our very clear plea.
Thank you very much, Robert. So, fascinating comments once again. You're a global business based on local presence. In the end, farming starts in the soil and starts in the ground. And so as much as we like to talk about globalization, things start locally, have to start locally by definition. but your emphasis on agility, innovation, and sustainability are key, and we absolutely need to think about them. And it is of course expected that you as a business, what you look for is agility, the ability of things to move, of goods to move without obstacles, and when we have to keep these things in mind. Barry, I will now come to you and turn to finance. As the representative of Rabobank on this panel, how do food systems impact international trade and trade finance and vice versa? What has been Rabobank's experience, and which obstacles have you identified?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Let me start saying that the following. Just I would like to agree with the fellow speakers. Farmers are the solution, or a very important part of the solution, and also that yes, food is a global business. So let's start with that. So why is that so important? Because if you look at the global, it is just from a geopolitical point of view, is it a fact that where we can produce food is unfortunately not the place where we have the people today. So if you look at Asia, where 60% of the people live today, they only have 35% of the arable land and less, I think something like 20% of the available water. If you compare it to Brazil, where I come from originally, we only have 3% of the global population, 6% of arable land, but 13% of water. So it's a natural thing. It's a natural that we will have trade. So my view is, will trade be there in food? Yes, there's no way around it. So we need to make sure that we as society and the FSS, we make sure that we agree how are we going to organize this trade and make sure that it's well organized. The other part, which I think is very important for the FSS, is that we have to acknowledge that there are certain regions in the world that can produce food with a much lower footprint than other regions. We know today that we sometimes are producing food in regions that don't make sense to produce. You're producing tropical fruits almost in moderate or temperate climate. That's just not going to work. We need to have rules and regulations that allow that actually we produce the food on the places that make the most sense to do that. Also, why that's so important that we have good trades agreement, because food production is a very risky business. Because we do have the problem of climate. People forget about it. Sometimes you have drought in one place, you have, let's say, too much water somewhere else. So you need to compensate that through the trade, because there's no way that you have harmonization. We all know the worst thing that can happen to the world is that in 5 producing regions or 3 producing regions, we have drought at the same time, or floodings. So trade is essential to balance that. And then it's not only that we need to balance that, it's also make sure that then with that process, we don't have hunger anymore in the world. Because I say, about what you said, look, it's number 2, it's about hunger, but it's also about distribution, proper distribution and good systems to rapidly distribute the food globally. So that's the way we as Rabobank are looking at. So as a global food and agri bank, what we think we need to have a strong, and then I come to the trade finance side, we need to have the strong trade finance arm to be able to connect those global value chains from origin to where the consumption is, and also be flexible because those things have to change very rapidly. So one of the big roles of the banks is obviously to be able to finance this trade flow. It's very important that there are banks that have capital, have knowledge, because sometimes people think it's only about capital. No, it's also about trade finance knowledge, so that and systems that can do that, so that we can link. So what I'm seeing today, where I have a worry, is that the cost of compliance for banks to manage a global network is going up. We are seeing that the frauds in trade finance are going up. And all of that that the risk appetite statement of a lot of my colleagues is coming to a certain moment that they are starting to reduce their global networks. That means that you take knowledge away and you take trade finance away. And why this is also happening is because you have this operational risk coming through the whole chain. It comes, then you will have a bigger charge of capital, which that's come from our models. That's all right. That's the way the system works. But we need to reduce the risk of trade and commodity finance. And why we can only do that if we were going to look at the world. And I really like the concept of global value chains. If we keep looking at the world as a global value chain, and if you look at that, you can reduce the risk. And then I think that's where the WTO has a very important role. I would love if WTO would be the keeper of a big blockchain where we could really put there all the information. We have compliance already done. So we know who the exporters are, who are the buyers. We know all the documents flow. You put one document there. So you are the gatekeepers, you are our trusted gatekeepers of the information where we can access to the blockchain technology. And that would be actually very, very, very nice. And that's my plea. The solution is there. We need to use technology, but let's not forget, it's not farm to fork, it's fork to farm, please. So then we don't have waste. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Fork to farm, I'll need to think about that. Some very thoughtful comments there, Barry. Indeed, you've said some things that are absolutely obvious now that you've said them, which is that arable land is somewhere, but people are somewhere else. Water is somewhere, but land is somewhere else. And so clearly, what is needed is rapid distribution, as you said. And the key to that rapid distribution and the key to functioning global value chains is finance, creating the finance and reducing the risk associated with that trade. So thank you very much. And we will certainly convey your comments of the WTO is the keeper of the blockchain. Ariana, I'd like to come to you. As Secretary General of the World Farmers Organization, what can you tell us about how farmers perceive that they can be enabled to trade? What do farmers need to do business across borders?
Thank you very much, Doa. I'm honored, very happy to be with you. Thanks for having me today. And I'm here to express the voices of 1.5 billion farmers that WFO represents across all continents. Our members are national farmers unions, including in our constituencies, very big and very small scale farmers, family farmers from all over the world.
That's a shame because people taking a screenshot of it.
I think there's an unmuted microphone in the background. Sorry, Eric.
No problem. We're getting used to this digital space. No issues. So, before answering to your points, everybody, all of my colleagues before my intervention referred to the farmers. And we, the farmers, we feel we anchor food system. We are profoundly aware that is on our shoulders as people, economic actors in this food world, food systems world, that the difference can be made. But as economic actors, we bear on our shoulders the whole risk of not only feeding this world with a growing population, but also of making sure that we respect those planetary boundaries that were evoked, and that we contribute to enhance biodiversity, to have healthy, nutritious food delivered to the people, to those consumers that on the other side of the value chain, at the very end of the chain, they are making choices that have a direct impact on what we farm every day. So trade, let's say, what do we need to be enabled to trade? Let me start back to basics, frankly speaking. If we are not creating as a pre-requirement a solid set of physical and digital infrastructures, both in global south and global north of this world, farmers cannot even start thinking about trade in many situations. I'm in particular thinking about my members, WFO members from Ghana, or they are claiming the lack of railways, of roads to be able to reach the nearest town. So how can we pretend they might even think bigger? And from other countries, logistic systems, improved logistics to make sure the farmers can be enabled to trade, or connectivity. I mean, rural areas are the least connected areas, but we know that the path of digital transformation is actually opening the doors to incredible possibilities for the farmers to improve the quality of the production system, and therefore delivering against the objectives that are expected on sustainability. So that's my first point for you today on the enablers. And if I have to pick a second one, probably I would pick the value chain. Everybody is talking about food systems, but from the farmer's perspective, it's time to stop thinking in the old and industry-led supply chains approach to embrace a true value chain approach where all the actors are partnering up to create sustainable food systems. If this is a system, we need a value chain that is inclusive, that is fair, that is able to deliver value to all the actors, starting with the farmers, that is able to be transparent so that consumers can make informed choice, that is able to prevent an excessive concentration of power that as a result is shrinking, is limiting the capacity of the farmers to earn a decent living out of what they're doing. Excessive concentration of power in the hands of a few big global players means typically that the quality, for instance, of contracts is very difficult to manage from the farmer's perspective. So moving to a value chain approach, moving to a true food systems vision, we could start, for instance, working on contracts that are recognizing the true cost of food production. If we want farmers to deliver on the environmental standards, and by the way, farmers want to deliver on this, we must make sure that the cost that they're bearing is somewhere shared by all the actors in the value chains. And finally, it has already been evoked. A third point that I want to share with you is about trade policies. So policies are fundamental for sure, but we think from the farmer side that we must be more ambitious. We need coherence between trade policies and these food systems approach. So we need climate dimension to be embedded on this. We need the food security dimension to be embedded in how we think about trade policies. So talking about trade, there's much more than simply regulating the cross-borders exchanges. And it's important that we keep it very clear in our minds that when a policy is embraced in one region of the world, the effects on the farmers are shared also in other regions. I want to share with you a last example. So the discussions going on in Europe around the Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy are creating rising concerns, not only among the farmers, the European farmers, when they think about international trade, because they are not so sure that the additional efforts on the environmental standards will be reflected in the global price. But they are also creating fears and concerns in Africa. For instance, the African members of WFO are looking with increasing concerns at the discussions in Europe, fearing that those standards may then be transformed into barriers for them to be able to access those rich markets. Thank you. Over to you, Doa.
Thank you very much, Ariana. I can imagine, as you said, that farmers feel that the entire burden of food systems is on their shoulders. So here we are, debating the transformation of food systems from a variety of different perspectives. But in the end, it comes down to the farmer, and the farmer having to deliver all the long list of reforms that is coming up, or at least having to implement some of those reforms. Global value chains, again, and your emphasis on that, and on trade policies. And then, of course, your very striking example of your Ghanaian farmers saying, well, where are the roads? Where are the railways? So some basic infrastructure is needed. I would now like to come to you, Michael, on Aid for Trade. Can you tell us what is Aid for Trade and what it can do for the agricultural sector? Can you give us a specific developing country example in the agricultural field?
Thanks very much for the question, Doa, and my apologies for joining a little bit late. I'd like to say that this is just-in-time delivery, which of course for perishable products like agricultural products is absolutely essential. So I guess that's one of the aspects that AvaTrade is trying to address, and this is something that Ariana, I think, teed up very nicely in her comments around the infrastructure dimension. So if you, without giving you a full historical perspective, let me just give you a kind of a potted background. So when then Director General Pascal Lamy launched the initiative, his perspective was very much on why are developing countries and LDCs not using the market access opportunities that are there for them. And then this speaks to Ariana's points about all of those constraints, either behind the border, lack of infrastructure, at the border in terms of the ability to meet customs or labeling or standards requirements, to understand contracts. There's a whole range of different aspects. So there, his idea was to try and launch an initiative that would increase the focus on these issues and then try and mobilize resources for to address them. So that's what the AvaTrade initiative has been doing since 2005. And you'll see that actually I haven't changed my background logo from last week. This is for the event that we had last week, which ran through many of these issues in a COVID context. And so then let me maybe just pick up on that COVID context. Clearly there, one of the things that's become very evident during the crisis is the need to reduce human contact. So that's human contact between traders, between agricultural suppliers and their customers, and customs border points. So this is talking about digitization. So a lot of the examples that we had last week were looking at how to digitize these processes, to be able to introduce apps at farmer level, to be able to be thinking about understanding and training on such issues about blockchain, etc. But all of that requires obviously an infrastructure behind it, which needs to be funded. So there, the actions of the World Bank, other international financial institutions, all of those things in the AvaTrade, in the agricultural area would be classed as and counted as AvaTrade. And lastly, I think what you're also seeing is an increasing amount of private sector investment being drawn into the sector too, looking at opportunities for diversification. So one of the areas that our colleagues at the Development Assistance Committee, the DAC in the OECD, and the work that Marion has been looking at has been very much sort of focusing on that blending. How can you get the traditional official development assistance to be smarter in the sense of crowding in private sector investment, taking some of the risk away for the likes of Unilever and other companies operating globally, but also locally as well. So that gives you an overview of what AvaTrade is and how it operates in the agriculture sector. Happy to follow up in the next question. And again, apologies, but it was just in time.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much for your comments. You know, Aid for Trade is there to help people overcome all the practical hurdles that are out there and that face a trader. So, as you said, how to implement a contract, how to finalize and how to implement a contract. And your comments about smarter ODA and bringing in the private sector and blending and all of that, I think is very important. Melvin, I'd like to come to you now. What is the Standards and Trade Development Facility? Can you explain it to our viewers? How does it support developing and least developed countries? And do please feel free to give us an LDC example.
Yeah, thank you, Doa, for that question. So the STDF is a global multi-stakeholder partnership that supports and promotes improved food safety, animal and plant health capacity in developing countries, with a special focus on least developed countries. And this helps their imports and exports to meet
sanitary and phytosanitary, or what we call in jargon SPS requirements for trade based on the international standards. So the FAO and the World Bank are among the core founding partners, while the STDF Secretariat and the trust fund of the STDF is housed and managed by the WTO. Now, Michael just explained what Aid for Trade is. And so the STDF basically, I would say, is a very concrete example of Aid for Trade in action in a sector, SPS and agriculture, that is highly relevant for many developing countries in terms of economic growth, in terms of jobs, food security, poverty reduction, a lot of the issues mentioned by Ariane and also by others in previous interventions. So how do we provide support? Well, the STDF is first of all a global platform for dialogue and learning on SPS capacity development. Boubacar already spoke about the importance of knowledge work and identifying good practices. But the STDF also acts as a funding mechanism for projects to address food safety, animal and plant health issues that affect developing countries' ability to gain and to maintain also market access. So by convening and connecting stakeholders from across agriculture, health, trade, development, across also STDF knowledge and its project work, and through piloting and learning, through innovative and collaborative approaches, the STDF aims to influence SPS capacity development globally. Now, we have funded more than, I would say, at the moment, 200 projects, and there are many examples, but maybe just to give you one, you asked for one in a least developed country, in an LDC. Several years ago, we developed and we funded a project to promote partnerships across the public and the private sector in Nepal to increase ginger exports. And that project, by the way, was implemented by FAO together with the ministries of agriculture and trade and the Nepal Ginger Producers Traders Association. And under that project, very interestingly, more than 2,000 farmers, and most of them were actually women, were trained on good agricultural practices, good hygiene practices, but also on improved techniques to control pests and diseases. So the project had a food safety component, but also had this plant health, this phytosanitary component. And as a result of that project, post-harvest losses, for example, dropped by 30%. Gita, in her remarks, spoke about the importance of tackling food loss issues, for example. And we also saw that incomes rose by 60%. The project also procured, interestingly, a ginger washing facility, which the farmers needed. And that provided an additional 200 seasonal jobs. But as a result of the project, washed ginger is exported to Bangladesh, to India, and there are even more opportunities in higher value markets in Europe, in Japan, and also in the Middle East. So it's a project like this that should be replicated, in my view, and donors can play an important role. Aid for Trade can play an important role in scaling up these type of projects through seed funding, among others. And perhaps, just to provide another cool example that comes to mind is a series of projects we have just started now in Asia and also in Southern Africa and soon also in Latin America, focused on reducing maximum residue limits, or MRLs, for pesticides, including through the use of bio pesticides in the last phase of production of fruits and vegetables. And that facilitates safe trade, opens markets, including for small, medium enterprises. But the projects will also have a positive impact on food safety and also domestically, and we'll see environmental benefits too. So there are many examples, and all these examples are documented and available on the STDF website. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Melvin. And indeed, I think it is key that we have had the STDF on this webinar, because as the preparatory process for the Food Systems Summit has been unfolding, and as questions have arisen as to how can we enable trade, how can we be enabled to trade, I think it was very important for the WTO to show that in partnership with many other agencies, something like the Standards and Trade Development Facility has been created, and that it is there to assist countries and farmers and in fact the entire supply chain in rising to the required level of standards and quality and safety. And I think your examples on ginger production in Nepal is, those examples are just great, and I hope that they help our viewers visualize how we can help. I'll now move to the second round of questions. Let me ask Barry if he has time for the first question or if he needs to jump off this webinar. I know he has a time constraint.
I'm okay, no worries. I can do some minutes.
Barry,
I will be brief then.
Excellent.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Let me very quickly ask you this. There can be no trade without trade finance. WTO members have been discussing for years how to have the financing itself be fair and the access to that financing. What are your views on this? And also, how can sustainability linked trade finance support international trade?
Well, as I said in my opening statement, I'm really believing that we will come to the point, and I think Geta said that also, is that we will have to look at where we can produce the best nutrition at the best place in the world, right? So, as I said, I think that there are some produce that will be better produced in Brazil, some others will be better produced in Thailand, or some others will be better produced in the Netherlands or where you'll be in the world. So, in my view here, it's actually pretty straightforward. I think that we have to go over to a structure and agree a framework in FSFs, or maybe later, that we can start pricing nature in the products that we are consuming. So we talked about the consumer, but the consumer today just doesn't know. How can the consumer know if he's taking the right decision? I am a consumer, I go to the supermarket, I see 2 tomatoes, I have no clue which one is okay and which one is not okay. I have no clue how much water is in there, how much water was consumed, how much CO2. So in my view, we have to go to a new system, new global system, which is a system with the true pricing. And if you start to put nature in that price, in that product, I think trade finance will follow, because trade finance is also going to look at where you have the least risk and the best, most interesting, let's say, nutritionness is the way you have the best risk. So for me, we really need to develop these metrics. We need to agree amongst ourselves, what do we want to measure? We have to agree amongst ourselves, what's the value of the things that we're putting into the nature? And of course, you can say, yeah, you have to include biodiversity. You have to include a lot of other stuff. But if you would only start with 2 of them, which is the 2 basic ones, carbon or carbon equivalent and water, that would already most probably cover 80% of all issues. And then we would follow the rest. It's just, my view is a very simple one. So that I would love to be financing, let's say, trade finance there that could have the price of the product of the production, the price of the nature in there. And I think that we have to develop a new asset class, which is how much nature is in the products that we produce. So that's the true pricing. And I have really always this dream that we will issue bonds in New York, which are nature-based, but true nature-based bonds. And then we really can finance this whole trade, because then you will have people buying not only financial return, but we will also be looking at nature return, and we only be looking, and then I think I really fully endorse the idea of the smallholder farmers. We also will trade social impact, and that's what we are looking at. We as a bank, we as a financial sector need the metrics, need the standard, so that we can really create new classes of assets that we can finance. Noah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Barry, for that. And I love how you have framed this, how much nature is in our products. I think that's exactly, you've put it so simply that I think this can resonate with every single consumer as they go to the supermarket. How much nature am I looking at in this product? Thank you for that. And I will be keeping that in mind as I go to the supermarket the next time.
And I really apologize. I really have to go to an FSS meeting. Thank you very much for having me. Everybody, the panelists, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Geeta, let me turn to you. Trade policy reform and the move from state-driven to market-driven policies can be complicated both economically and politically at the national level. What are the enabling conditions for successful reform in your view? And what is the food trade policy reform nexus?
Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad Barry went before me because I think he alludes to a very important aspect of the food trade nexus, which is we really need to start thinking of carbon as a tradable commodity. Now, it can take many forms, but I think that is going to be critical, seeing the kind of risks that are coming down the pike that do not know boundaries the way we think of boundaries. Having said that, very quickly, I think when we think of food trade nexus, we need to think of three broad areas for reform. And Barry already also alluded to this. First, that the global food prices do not reflect the environmental costs of food production, especially the greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity losses. And we need to think about how to internalize these environmental costs into the global food trade. Maybe through carbon taxes applied at points of trade, reflecting the emissions generated in the supply chains. Maybe through non-tariff barriers to disincentivize countries to expand agriculture into forested and wildlands that offer a myriad of environment services, etc. But one can almost think of an additional label almost in terms of the carbon cost of a tradable. Second, trade must be able to stabilize food prices in the presence of catastrophic events that disrupt food supply chains. And COVID is right behind us in terms of setting this context. The time could not be more ripe when we're thinking about food systems transformation fit for the next decade, that the global governance around trading of these commodities is so important, and really does require big rethink. This also means, as a sub point, is that for diversifying sources of imports and exports, the majority of which are really concentrated, and my fellow panelists already raised this, is concentrated in a small number of countries. More developing countries need to be brought into the global trade system, which also means that besides the global governance and role of WTO, etc., it needs to be in tandem in improving also the domestic policies and the trade infrastructure in nations to really shorten the distance of food to the ultimate consumers. And the third, again, my fellow panelists have talked about this, we need to use trade to influence the composition of diets towards really a healthier consumption. Most trade today evolves around a very limited set of commodities, largely staples, cereals, sugars, oilseeds. But the healthier diet demands a much higher consumption of perishables, fruits, vegetables, etc. And so what is the kind of the trade regime and the related infrastructure to support this? And this means both the regulatory and regimes as well as investments, including agro-logistics, cold chains, ports, etc. You talked about India, and I think India is a very fascinating example. It is very important looking forward, in part because if you look at where the largest demand of increased production consumption is, it's Africa and India in the coming years. And yet, we can come up with a very large technical analysis, evidence, science, and we've been talking about it here. But at the end of the day, if we have a public support program that is largely subtracting value, it means that there is a very important political economy. We need to really identify winners and losers We need some kind of income support programs to kick in on day one to actually manage this political economy, to allow reforms to happen. India really has started on a path of big, important reforms around the food system. It needs to, and it has demonstrated that to really bring in the stakeholders, to have a much more detailed conversation with all the relevant parties in their local channels, international channels, different points of view. So at the end of the day, when a reform is being deliberated and voted upon, it's actually done with some knowledge rather than just slipping it through and really underscoring the political economy of moving towards more sustainable food systems. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Geeta. And your comment about trade needing to be the stabilizing force for food prices in catastrophic events is a very strong comment. As you know, unfortunately, the instinct very often of countries faced with catastrophic events is to restrict trade, which takes me to my next question to Marion. Has 2020, Marion, and the COVID-19 crisis legitimized protectionism? And what are the dangers for global agricultural value chains?
Thank you, Doha. My answer to your first question is a very strong no. And I will answer in my story your two questions around two anecdotes. One, an anecdote from 1 year ago, and the other, an anecdote from 2 years ago. 1 year ago, in the beginning of the lockdown, after severe lockdown in Europe, I had, for a family emergency reason, to take my car and to travel to Europe. Through Europe. I was on a highway that was emptied of private cars. Hardly any normal cars on the road. But the highway was full of trucks. And Doha, I tell you that in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis and of the family emergency I had, I was looking at these trucks with hope. I never would have thought that I would look like trucks so much than in that day, because those trucks were signaling to me that distribution was continuing. They were signaling to me that the shops would remain open, that the supermarkets would have food. And at that moment, we were afraid of not having access to food in the supermarkets. Trade held its promise in most of the markets that we had to deal with in that period. Not all of them. And that's why we're seeing critical looks. We were concerned about masks. We were concerned about disinfectants. We are now concerned about vaccines. And fortunately, Michael Roberts is dealing with that problem, as I just heard. But we were facing that problem not because trade wasn't delivering. The world was facing a huge global demand shock, an increase in demand that could not immediately be solved. But it was solved ultimately in the case of protective equipment and most medical products we needed. And in the case of vaccines, global demand has increased for something that didn't even exist. And in a very rapid way, the markets have responded to this. So no legitimization for protectionism. What are the risks for global markets in agriculture? I see 3 risks. One of them is that the wrong policies are going to be taken, notwithstanding my clear no. Not everybody agrees with me. So more protectionism may be coming. And we do see continued restriction in travel for good reasons, health reasons, but this is also affecting markets. It's starting to affect markets. We see increased screening conditions for investment. That may also affect supply chains. So first, policies. Second, demand shifts. We have seen demand shifts for food. People cannot go to restaurants anymore. They go to supermarkets. So that is a demand shift that markets had to adjust to. Some of a reverse adjustment may have to take place, but we also see regions or countries coming out of the crisis at different speeds. That will also affect demand, and therefore the supply chains or the value chains, as Ariana said, have to adjust. So first the policy, second demand shifts, and my third concern is climate change. And here I will tell my second anecdote. What happened 2 years ago in my life? 2 years ago, Doa, I was working in Switzerland still. And on a Friday, I received the data from our farmer survey in Zambia, Zambia being an LDC. And we had asked farmers there whether they are concerned about the climate. On that same Friday, my adolescent daughters were phoning me because they wanted to go and demonstrate on the Fridays for Future to support policies that are favorable for climate change. So I was dealing with these two issues, data from farmers from an LDC. And what I saw in this data is that 70% of those farmers said we are concerned about climate change. And 50% of them were investing in measures to become more climate friendly or more resilient against climate change. This is going on in Zambia. And at the same time, my adolescent daughters in one of the wealthiest countries of the world were concerned about the same issues as the Zambian farmers. So Barry has a dream. Maybe we have coalitions of interest groups. And remember, I said understanding interest is important currently at the globe that can help us to make that dream come true.
Thank you very much, Marion. Yes, indeed, I couldn't agree with you more. There should be no legitimization for protectionism. Robert, I would now like to come to you. We know that Unilever has big sustainable ambitions. What can Unilever concretely do to help make agribusiness more sustainable? And what would you request from governments to be able to get to that goal?
Yeah, thanks, Doa. Good question. Look, I think many of the facts were already touched on in the beginning of the call, where 2 billion people overweight, 1 billion, going to bed hungry still, a third of the food being wasted at the moment. I think actually the most staggering fact of it all is that, the way how we currently have set up the system, actually we are exhausting the Earth's resources, right? And we are fueling climate change to such an extent that we can seriously doubt if we can continue to live the way that we currently live in all its inequality, if we don't intervene. Yeah. So we believe when we are looking at an end-to-end food value system, these are definitely topics we need to tackle. And that for that reason, also from our end, from a Unilever perspective, we've made some very strong commitments on what we see as our responsibility. Why? Every day, 500 million of our products are being consumed all across the world. So it's our responsibility to lead that transformation of the food system using our scale and our reach. We're committing to driving a much larger share of plant-based business, helping to help consumers to transition towards healthier diets and reducing the environmental impact. We've made commitments on reducing food waste, but also in reducing calorie, salt, and sugar levels to make sure that we're driving that needed transformation. Now, if you then question, how can governments help? I think the first one, obvious probably, but still current practice, we've got some practices in place where governments are stimulating production of materials to which we know today are not actually beneficial if we want to, try to reduce greenhouse gases. So think about the subsidizing of the meat industry. I think we should put that money to a different use, not taking it away from the farmer, because it's not the farmer's fault that he or she has been educated, and that market has been created. But we have to stop subsidizing the common practice and to start subsidizing the transformation that is required. Yeah, and helping those farmers to, grow different kind of agricultural products that better fit to a balanced diet that we require to stop this greenhouse gas emission. Ideally, we then don't only convert them to plant-based crops, the 7 plant-based crops that we already overconsume in the world, but we would use the money to immediately stimulate the right kind of biodiversity. Yeah. With Knorr, we've committed to the Future 50 program, that was developed together with WWF, stimulating a larger biodiversity, and it's our task to make sure that we create the demand. Yeah, many consumers, they don't really mind in that sense, but if we can make, more mung bean starch versus some of the previous starches that we used, we can help to drive a demand for that biodiversity. I think another thing, we talked about smallholder farmers quite a bit. Make no mistake, we work with many of them, and we expect it's more than over 1.5 million smallholder farmers that help us to produce the products that we sell globally. They together support more than 7 million people globally from an income perspective. I think what governments can do is put in place first the right kind of infrastructure. When I was working in Africa myself, it was really painful to see that there were many of these smallholder farmers growing crops, but actually the inability to ship them out in time, and not letting them perish because the roads were too poor in many periods of the year to ship the product out. Yeah. So it is first and foremost putting the right kind of infrastructure in place to allow these smallholder farmers to make the most out of their yield, and then not only be dependent on private sector and NGOs to help to develop these smallholders, but also stimulate smallholder farmers to, make more sustainable kind of sources, driving that biodiversity. For many of them, they don't have the ability to change over to a different kind of crop because they can't miss the income. Yeah. So you need to find ways how we allow these smallholder farmers to make that conversion while they're able to still continue to feed their family. Yeah. And in that sense, I'm also very happy that we've been able to make a commitment, latest by the end of 2030, that everybody who will be supplying our company in terms of, agricultural goods or any other kind of raw materials that we use, will be able to make a fair living wage. If governments would also embrace such an ambition and policy, I think we would be able to speed that up, yeah? Because then we would not need to wait to 2030, but we could probably do it a lot faster. Yeah? So on those topics, but first stopping the things that really don't make sense with the knowledge of today, and then using, let's say, some stimulation to drive some of the further change that we need. That would really be helpful and allow us to even go faster.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you had a very good sentence in that intervention, which is that we need to stop subsidizing business as usual, and we need to start subsidizing the transformation. So I think we really need to pay attention to that. And we also need to create the demand for more sustainable products. It won't automatically fall in our laps. It needs to be created and awareness needs to be raised. Thank you very much for that. Boubacar, let me come to you. There's clearly a need to modernize agriculture. What modernization agenda, in your view, would most enhance agricultural trade? Can you walk us through some of the issues?
Thank you, Doa, for the very topical question. And it is, in fact, a big question, I would say. The word modernization captures the transformative impact of digital technologies, of innovation, which help us to respond to multiple needs, for instance, to address market failure, to lower transaction costs, and also to increase efficiency in trade, among many others. I would say the potential of digital technologies for enhancing agriculture trade was particularly, and we all recall, it was particularly evident in 2020, the beginning with the outbreak of COVID-19, as Marion was saying in her examples, when countries actually sought to mitigate the effects of the disruption caused by the pandemic through the implementation of various trade facilitation measures. And these included, for instance, several countries accepted or have started to accept electronic SPS certificates through schemes such as the e-FITO. Others established the green corridors that allowed for increased automation and more efficient data sharing among customs and other concerned authorities. So these are to serve as example how digitalization actually has helped or served us to face the crisis. However, I also think, Doa, that beyond the trade promoting effects of digitalization at the borders, the modernization agenda should take a broader view of agriculture trade by also considering opportunities for digital technology across the entire global value chain. So I take you back to the concept of global value chain, because we think it's a very, very important emerging point, and to go beyond just digitalization at the border. So I think it is important also to consider how this comes into play. For instance, I would say it is in particular important to consider agriculture services, where digital solution can be particularly useful in facilitating smallholder farmers integration into markets and value chains. I think Ariana was also covered some points related to this. And this can cover many areas. I would mention very briefly, for example, in the area of farm insurance, also in the area of access to credit, in terms of facilitating farm to market linkages, and of course, all the sector of transport and logistics, and the area of traceability, which is gaining a lot of attention. And in this regard, blockchain technology can build the trust and promote transparency along the value chain, and supporting the implementation of sustainability standard and labeling that provide also information what has emerged in the discussion to consumer on environmental and social dimension of production. So consumers are getting now more aware, or increased awareness in terms of the impacts, or in terms of the production and the real cost, let's say, of the food product they are buying. I would also want to say that while there is a significant scope for widespread adoption and benefit of such technology, it is important to recognize there are also, and this entails risks and challenges. And for instances, I would mention very few that we need to be mindful of. So in terms of the digital tools, so despite the rapid diffusion of digital technologies during the last 3 decades, we still have a digital divide that continue to exist between countries, and also within countries, between urban and rural area, and between men and women. There are, of course, also issues related or concerns about the ownership and use of data collected on farm through digital tools or digital technologies, and also a broader concern about the impacts of digital technology on competitiveness, which I addressed in the first question. But more on the impacts on the demand for labor, on the wages, what's going to happen there, and the effects on prices, on quantities, and overall welfare. So there are many dimensions, I would say, that need to be taken into consideration here. But in conclusion, I would just say that there is a lot of potential, certainly, for modernization in the agriculture and food sectors, in markets, in trade. However, issues, I think, that need to be further analyzed and better understood. And this is very important in terms of impacts, especially when it comes to poorer countries, when it comes to small-scale producers, to smallholders, to small fishers. I think it is very, very important that we gain a better understanding of what's happening there. And also, we require, what I would say, a better collaboration among all the stakeholders, to shape a framework that will minimize the risks, but that aims at maximizing the benefits of digital technology and ensuring a better inclusivity in terms of participation and gaining benefits from the increased digitalization. So I would stop there, Doa, and then over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boubacar, and thank you for reminding us that the relationship between COVID and international trade has not all been negative. In fact, COVID has spurred a lot of innovation and trade facilitation, like the e-certificates you spoke about, like the green corridors you spoke about, like the data sharing. So there is indeed a positive side as well to the crisis. Thank you. Ariana, I'd like to come to you, and this is a bit of a difficult question, a bit of a political question. In the World Farmers Organization, you have farmers who are pro-trade and you have farmers who are against trade. How can a pro-trade stance be reinforced within the WFO? And what are some of the politics involved in a forum such as yours?
Thank you very much, Doa, for such a provocative question. So I take it for a real wish to provoke an answer from the farmers community. You know, let me be very frank with you. We farm, and at the end of the day, we have families sitting around the table and children to feed. Well, if we don't sell our products, we will not be able to feed our families. And 98% of the WFO members are family farmers, by the way, across the globe. So farmers cannot be against trade as a concept, because farmers are economic actors. And by definition, farming is a business, and there's no sense in a business if we cannot get a return, get an income out of the activity that we are doing. Clearly, I am kind of exaggerating also the accent that I'm putting on this, but I think it's important to say it, and to say it loud and clear. Farmers must sell their products at a fair price if they want to feed their own families and grow. And when they are smallholders and poor, maybe exit from the poverty level and start dreaming bigger. So trade is important, but where is it then things start to become tricky and you have different positions? It's when we try to polarize between local and global, when we try to say this is good, this is bad, when we try to push the farmers one way or the other. And, you know, from the WFO perspective, trade is so important to farmers that it was one of the first policy statements adopted by the WFO General Assembly, which is composed by those national farmers organizations from across the globe. It was one of the first policies adopted back in 2013. So can we say trade is not important? No, not at all. But believe me, we must make sure that we inform the trade policies and the trade vision of what we call the farmer-driven approach. Being farmer-driven doesn't mean considering farmers the only actors, or all of the opposite, actually. But it means having farmers at the driving seat, having farmers sitting at the table together with the other actors and the policymakers to shape the best opportunities, to shape the best policies, and to define that enabling framework where everybody can make his or her choice. Do you want to sell the food you produce to your village? Please feel free to do it. Are you aiming at selling your products in global value chains throughout borders? These are the conditions that will allow you to make your choice as an entrepreneur in the value chain. Otherwise, if we do not operate in this way, the risk is that farmers can feel they are exploited, can feel they are used as bargaining chips on the table of negotiations that are affecting them without recognizing their efforts and without really taking care of them as actors in the global value chains. When you operate the other way, the farmer-driven approach, farmers are the first that wants to contribute and to propose, and that prove that I already invest in. For instance, let me share with you an example that goes beyond trade and looks at the climate challenge that we have at the moment we're facing. In 2018, WFO launched with other players of the value chain and with civil society and with academia an initiative on climate that we call the Climakers, with the aim of proving to the world that when you build with the farmers solutions that are science-based and profoundly pragmatic, deeply rooted in the activity on the farm, you can improve, for instance, the quality of the nationally determined contributions, and you can better deliver against the global challenges. So my plea, my wish here is really to make sure that we are embracing the very same spirit when it concerns the trade. Thanks.
What an excellent response. Thank you so much, Ariana. Clearly, you know, farmers are businessmen and farmers want to sell their products. And we tend to forget that. You know, it is easy to characterize some farmers as protectionist, but at the end of the day, if they don't sell their products, then they have failed and they will not be able to ensure their very own livelihood. I also very much like your comment about a farmer-driven approach and the need to have the farmers at the table so they do not feel exploited. Melvin, let me come to you. How can farmers and agribusiness best prepare themselves for a world where food safety and food quality standards and food labeling requirements are becoming increasingly complex? Issues like food traceability and the rise of private standards, for example, by large-scale buyers such as supermarkets. All of these can represent a very significant challenge for farmers and agribusiness. What is your perspective as head of the STDF?
Thank you, Doa. And that's a very interesting question because, yeah, normally I would get the question, how can governments best prepare themselves? Because, yeah, our primary audience in the end is regulators. But I think that, you know, for farmers and agribusinesses, the level of compliance with food safety and with quality requirements really depends on the market. And that could be, let's say, a domestic market, it could be a traditional food market, it could be a small shop, it could be a local restaurant, a hotel. And demand for, let's say, safety assurances in these markets is growing. I think we can see that because of issues like urbanization, rising middle class, growing food retail systems. But in many developing countries, that kind of demand is still, you know, weak in a way. And so farmers and agribusinesses then might also want to target perhaps a regional market or even an international market where the demand for safety assurances, including also traceability, which you mentioned, is often much higher. If we look at international markets especially, the controls in the supply chain are mainly carried out by private companies, but the government's only having a supervising role. And in these markets, the buyer is willing to pay a price premium for compliance, something that is often lacking in sort of the more traditional market segments. So I guess that for farmers and agribusinesses, that often then comes down to a business decision. If I invest in a food safety and a quality system in my company, then I should also be able to recoup that investment through a price premium. And that means that I guess farmers and agribusinesses should carefully consider their level of ambition and look at the availability of trade finance, infrastructure. Robert mentioned that. Explore the use of technology in meeting traceability requirements, for example. Abubakar mentioned blockchain, and we have seen some successful pilots there in blockchain. But again, the challenge is, you know, how do we scale that up? And sometimes I think that, yeah, a stepwise approach should be thought of. Everybody wants to achieve the gold standard. Many want to export to that retailer in Switzerland, but perhaps that is an objective that the farmer or an agribusiness may reach over time, and through a stepwise approach, it may get there. And there are initiatives also out there to support farmers and agribusinesses. I can think of the International Trade Center, for instance, and they have programs in place that focus on small, medium enterprises. And in the STDF, we work a lot with the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, under the Consumer Goods Forum, which manages the global markets program and which helps companies precisely to do that, to go through that sort of stepwise approach. Now, having said that, and maybe just coming back to the regulator as well, I think that, you know, especially in developing countries, governments also can play a very important role by promoting, for example, training on good agricultural practices, good hygiene practices, good manufacturing practices. And I think also by perhaps better controlling the safety and the quality of agricultural inputs. So especially thinking about pesticides and veterinary drugs and animal feed and seed and so on. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An enormous set of issues indeed, and it shows, you know, how vital instruments such as the STDF are, because I am sure that some farmers listening to this must feel, gosh, I can't do this by myself. Michael, let me come to you. How can aid for trade in agriculture be improved in your view? Is it a question of quantity or is it a question of quality, changing what is on offer?
Thanks, Doa. Let me answer by picking up some of the questions that, some of the answers and the issues that come out of the answers just a minute ago. And there, I think there's trying to really sort of square the circle between two things. One is the desire for economic diversification of many developing countries. And then the other focus is the adaptation to climate change and green growth. So, and the two kind of go hand in hand to a large extent. So if you look at economic diversification, 17 years after the start of the Aid for Trade initiative, and then within the 2030 agenda, economic diversification is still a central demand of developing countries. So that means, in the trade sense, it means exporting more and importing more products and reaching more markets. So if you look at the record of agriculture, of aid for trade in the agriculture sector, and through that narrow optic, it's been quite successful. So there you can see that if you look at, let's take African countries, it's almost a doubling at the level of the HS codes. So those are the sort of, the categories of different products that are exported. There's been an almost doubling of the number of products that are being, agricultural products that are being exported from Africa. And you see that also in some low-income countries as well. And that fits with points that others were making, as you see rising incomes, rising populations in other parts of the world. So you would expect that import demand to come. What we need to do, though, is obviously to square that with green growth and adaptation to climate change challenges. And then let me bring in the example of some other work that I did looking at natural disasters. So if we think that climate change is going to be a sort of a succession of shocks, rather than maybe, well, there's some gradual changes, but then also some successions of shocks. That's going to play out very differently within different segments of the agriculture sector. So there, I mean, take the experience in the Caribbean or the Pacific, root crops will come back very quickly after a hurricane or a cyclone. Trees is going to take a decade minimum. So there, you need to be thinking about sort of, two speeds here, and adaptation. So the various points that we're making were made there in terms of sort of, considering the nature content, the carbon content, the water content of agricultural trade. Obviously, those things are going to be need to be factored in, and unfortunately, you may be seeing a larger proportion of that aid budget, that overall aid budget, going to immediate responses to things like natural disasters as well. So there, I think it's a sort of there's going to be a continued focus on the quantity of assistance. The challenges are very big, but also in terms of the quality, with that idea of adaptation in mind. And very last final point, if you allow me, Doa, it reminds me of the discussion at the start of the Aid for Trade initiative around trade-related adjustment. So that was in terms of how do you compensate small farmers, small entrepreneurs in the industrial sector for opening up and the loss of preferences. It's going to be something that perhaps on a far larger scale in terms of thinking of that in a green growth sense. So for those points, back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Indeed, aid for trade that is more nature focused, more carbon focused, and so on, is very important. And you're absolutely right in putting the accent on these issues. We now have 20 minutes at our disposal and a lot of questions from the floor. I'm going to start fielding those questions to you. Can I ask you to please not take more than 1.5 minutes to 2 to answer these questions, so that I have time to get to each of the speakers. Marion, I will start with you. I have a question from a viewer who's saying the G7 just met and put the focus on industrial subsidies. What about agricultural subsidies? You know, it's an age-old problem. Has it just fallen off the shelf, they're saying?
Well, at OECD and actually in the directorate I lead, we have been following what is happening in the subsidies field in multiple areas for many years. I mentioned agricultural subsidies, producer support. We have been following what's happening in fisheries, support to fisheries, very relevant for WTO negotiations on fisheries. And we're looking into fossil fuel subsidies. We have started to look in my directorate at subsidy support to the industrial sector. This is an area where we measurement-wise are very much behind. So the G7 is working on industrial subsidies. We at the OECD are working across the entire range of subsidies because all of them have the potential to distort markets. And if, as is the case in the producer support to agriculture, they distort markets, do not give higher livelihoods for farmers and are bad for the environment, then the policies are simply not good policies.
Thank you very much, Marion, and thank you to the OECD for continuing to work on agricultural subsidies. Boubacar, let me come to you. A question from a viewer from a trade delegation in Geneva. They're saying just recently 16 agricultural exporting countries have signed a statement to the Special Envoy of the United Nations Food Systems Summit asking for the correction and prevention of trade restrictions and distortions in world agricultural trade. They also say open trade plays a vital part in ensuring and supporting global food security. No single economy can lay claim to full self-sufficiency. And the viewer is asking you, in your view, will the Food Systems Summit deliver anything at all on trade?
Thank you. Thank you, Doa. I think that's it's a difficult question. I'm from the Markets and Trade Division from FAO. We are very hopeful, and I hope the other colleagues, the panelists are the same. We are hopeful that something works out in related to trade. We noticed that, in fact, probably in the way leading to the summit up to now, probably trade has not been very prominent in the discussion, and I think we understand why. However, now countries and different stakeholders are realizing the importance of trade, and we are happy to do that. In fact, in FAO, we are preparing, my division, we are preparing a paper for the scientific committee on trade, and we also discussed about this, and then we will consult with you. So we are seeing that there is increased attention to trade. We are hopeful really there will be recognition for the importance of trade, transparent trade, open markets, and fair markets too. And so we are very hopeful. And what we can say, and like what Marion said, is that from our side, we are here to support, of course, the members, all stakeholders for a fruitful and hopefully a positive conclusion or outcome of the summit. So I would say that. Thank you, Doa.
Thank you. Ariana, a question to you. A viewer is saying, do farmers feel that the WTO engages them? And does the WTO need to speak directly to the farmer?
Thank you, Doa. Very good question. Typically at WFO, we tend to reverse the order, and we tend to say that we farmers, we first and foremost have the ownership and the responsibility to step up and engage the discussion with the relevant players. And therefore, a big yes, farmers should engage and are engaging with WTO in these discussions, and they probably should do it even more in the future. But again, I would say it first on the shoulders of the farmers to be promoting this engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariana. Geeta, a viewer is asking if there's some amount of food self-sufficiency that is still needed in today's world, and what you think of emergency public food stocks that some countries maintain.
Thank you, Joa. It's a very, very relevant question. I think what COVID-19 and 2020 have demonstrated that the food supply chains need to be agile. Countries do need to be able to move from global supply chains to local supply chains, depending on where there is a constraint or where there could be some kind of a handicap. So from that perspective, I think it's important to have the agility to move back and forth. I think it's also very important to really rethink our supply chains vis-a-vis carbon and what it means. I mean, I really like the concept of global value chains, but I don't think that means that it's choosing the global versus local. I think it's really encompassing a value chain and the agility to move back and forth. That's the first. I think on the stocks or the storage or the public distribution systems are largely around the staples, in part because staples is what can be stored. But when we think about healthy diets, both from the human health and the planet health, there needs to be a diversified palette or a plate. And the question then is, what does all of this mean for perishables? Because the entire public support that all my fellow panelists have talked about has largely been to basically, very limited food crops, which are in principle storable, and therefore a little bit of a rethink when we think about food systems fit for purpose in terms of how to move the public support from the staples to the perishables, and what kind of then agro-logistics are needed to support that transformation. I would like to answer it this way. Thanks. Back to you.
Very well answered indeed. Robert, a question for you. A viewer is saying a lot of smallholder farmers feel excluded from global value chains. What are companies such as Unilever doing to reach the smallholder farmer?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and indeed, the big tipping point is how we can help to to better connect the smallholder farmer with, let's say, the global demand. We believe one of the ways that we can do this is by creating an aggregated demand. Yeah, so you see that in many instances, we need to organize ourselves better. There are these farmer to market kind of initiatives where we're able to then say, okay, what are we looking for, and can we then aggregate the demand so that in such a way, we as a manufacturer are getting a reliable stream of good. And also the farmer is able to have a reliable, let's say, taking of his produce. If we do it, manufacturer by manufacturer, we're too inconsistent. So you need to get these demand aggregations in place, partnering together with other parties, and there's a lot of work in that sense going on. But I think that's the big initiative where we need to step up. So more farm to market kind of initiatives. To help us to better connect smallholder farmers with manufacturers. Also taking in some of the raw material, transformers into perspective. So think of companies like Cargill, etc., to help onshore, capabilities that we can then transform these agricultural products into, let's say, the materials that the manufacturers need in order to be able to produce with that. So it's quite a big question, but I think the solution is aggregating the demand, working together with the various parties to then indeed, be able to really provide a global marketplace for each and every smallholder farmer.
Thank you very much for that. Melvin, some viewers from least developed countries are saying farm to fork and questions of traceability feel surmountable when you're sitting in an LDC. The logistical infrastructure is simply not there to be able to comply. What are your views on this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, again, I think it comes down to the answer that I provided on the question earlier as well. is that sometimes what is necessary is taking a stepwise approach. So there are perhaps very stringent, traceability requirements if you would like to export to, let's say, an OECD market, and that might not be the market that you immediately, want to target as a small-scale farmer or a small medium enterprise. Perhaps, you first start with basic training on good practices in agriculture, in hygiene, in HACCP systems, and so on, and you start delivering that local market, and slowly and learning by doing, and by investing more, you can then move to sort of more sophisticated traceability systems. I think also that the use of technology, but we're just sort of in an infancy stage there, is also going to be more important. Boubacar already mentioned blockchain there as one of the options. Over.
Thank you very much. Michael, a question to you, a question that has come from several viewers, and I think it goes to the same thing. Viewers asking whether aid for trade is new money or it is a coordination mechanism for aid.
Less maybe coordination, more about coherence. So understanding what everybody's doing in the same space. So that the WTO is not going to tell the World Bank, you should be in that country, but not in that one. You should be doing that project, but not that one. And we wouldn't be doing that with the World Bank, the FAO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what you will find, what we're trying to do is contribute to coherence. So providing the information about who's doing what where. So understanding that the World Bank is doing a project on agricultural irrigation in, let's say, Senegal, FAO is providing policy advice, other donors are doing this, that, and the other, etc. So that contributing to coherence. It's not a coordination mandate. That coordination can only really be done by the national governments themselves on the basis of what they put in their national development strategies. It's that those needs and those trade-related needs that form the basis for aid for trade programming. So there, the idea is really trying to align the support as much as possible around the country needs. And through that, you're going to have coordination and better coherence. And then when you get it up to a sort of a multilateral level, then we can, with the support of Marian and her colleagues in at the OECD, who are giving the overall kind of trends on where aid money is going through the DAC, there we can spot where there's an emerging trend that we need to get on board on, like on digital connectivity, e-commerce, etc., and where there may be not enough support going. So, for example, in agriculture in a particular region. So it's much more, I think, about coherence rather than coordination per se. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think we only have time for one more question, which I will put to Boubacar. And in fact, it's two questions, Boubacar. I apologize. The first question by a viewer is, what can enabling agricultural trade do for nutrition? Can it improve? Can international trade improve the quality of people's nutrition? And the second question is a viewer asking for an update on the Digitalization Council that is being set up in the FAO.
Thank you, Dua. I will respond very quickly. In terms of trade and nutrition, I think that's a very important question. We are doing more work on this. Of course, as I said before, trade impacts or affects the four dimensions of food security, availability, access, stability, and utilization. And by having trade, international trade, by having markets open, by having food moves across borders, of course, we can contribute to improving nutrition. By having nutrition food moving from one place to the other, increasing the diversity that's available to consumer. Of course, also through trade, keeping prices affordable to consumer. I think there is a lot of benefit. But of course, trade can also contribute to some negative outcomes in terms of nutrition. What's important is to be aware of those outcomes and to take action in order how to reduce or limit them. But this is This is an important area. In fact, I'm also happy to say that in FAO, we are engaging in increased work on this, including country case studies to be more measure and to assess the impacts of trade on nutritional outcomes. However, certainly I can confirm there's a positive impact there. On the international platform for digital food and agriculture, yes, we have been engaged in this with many stakeholders and international organization, of course. And then we are in a very advanced stage. It will be going to our council in about 3 weeks from now. And then it has gone through the other governing bodies. The latest one was the program committee last week. And then it's progressing well. So we are hoping to see the implementation of the platform operational very soon. Thank you, Doha.
Thank you very much, Boubacar, and thank you to each and every panelist. I think this was an incredible event. I know that I myself have learned a tremendous amount through everything I've heard here. So on behalf of our viewers and myself and the WTO, a big thank you to you all. I'd like to thank our viewers for having stayed with us the full 2 hours, and I hope that this event has been helpful to the community of the United Nations Food Systems Summit in getting a better sense of the issues involved in international trade and some of the complexities we have to deal with in WTO and in other international organizations. I hope that this webinar has also enabled some of our viewers to put faces to names of people that you have heard of who work on international trade. Please feel free to contact us for any questions that arise in the preparatory process for the summit. We're here to help and we will remain engaged. Thank you very much and happy Easter, everyone. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.